Good morning. Try and say are all alone over there. Or all over on this side. All right, good morning. It is good to be here and glad to be able to have this time of study and discussion. Of course, we're looking at the book of Romans. If you want to be turning there in your Bibles to Romans chapter 2. And we are, of course, following Paul's his argumentation or following his logic. And what he's trying to prove is that we are saved through the gospel, chapter 1 and verse 16. And that the gospel is not a contradiction of the Old Testament. It's not God's way of turning his back on the Jewish people, but it's rather his way of fulfilling their scriptures. And it is the revelation of the righteousness of God, which was revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the just shall live by faith, chapter 1 and verse 17. And now we're seeing him turn to two groups of people. He turned to the Gentiles and he said, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against you because of your ungodliness and your unrighteousness, chapter 1 and verse 18. And then he went on to talk about all of their sins. And we noted that each of their sins were contradictions against nature. Nature is binding on us. Nature is pure. Nature can teach us. Why? Because it was divinely crafted. Because God set it in order. It was made by God. And so they're guilty. Without the gospel, they're hopeless because God's wrath is set against them. Who's he talking to now? Chapter 2. He's talking to the Jews, chapter 2 and verse 1. Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man. Who is the man we're going to be picking up in chapter 2 and verse 17 today? And that verse answers that question. He's talking to the Jews. What did we talk about 2 weeks ago? Chapter 2, verses 1 through 16. The Jews were standing in judgment of the Gentiles. They were judging them for all of these sins that he listed off in chapter 1. But Paul said that they were also storing up for themselves the wrath of God. Gentiles, chapter 1 verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Jews, chapter 2 and verse 5. But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath and the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. They're doing the same basic things that the Gentiles are. They are just as in need of the gospel as the Gentiles are, but as we're going to see today, that it takes a lot more convincing for the Jews than it does the Gentiles, because we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now, one thing that Paul does in his writings, one thing that we commonly see him doing, is he anticipates questions. He anticipates objections. He presents his argumentation. He presents his line of reasoning, and then he anticipates what someone might say about it or against it. For instance, he's going to come off this discourse about the sinfulness of the Jews, and what are the Jews going to be thinking at that point? Well, what good is there in being a Jew at all? Is there any positive anything about it at all? Well, chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, nobody asked this question, but Paul knew that that's what the follow-up would be, where he says, what advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. So this is what Paul does a lot of the times. Now think about this objection in light of what we're about to see in chapter 2, verses 17 through 29. Imagine someone saying, okay, sure, Paul, I know that there are those people out there living these sinful lives and doing all these things that you're talking about beginning in chapter 1 and verse 18, but not me. I'm a Jew. I have the law. I have the oracles of God. Why would I need the gospel if I already have the law? And that's not a far-fetched thought to think that these people were thinking in this way, because we do this a lot of the time, or at least most of us do. I'm not like them. I'm not like all the heathens in the world. But let's read this section and then press on. If I could get someone to read chapter 2, verses 17 through all the way to the end of chapter 2 and verse 29, please. All right, thank you very much. Any observations through that reading? Anything that stuck out to you? Hmm. Right. Yeah, it was circumcision was the kind of the outward sign that you're in a covenant relationship with God, and so it all all starts there in the life of a Jew. So that makes sense that that's where he would go, as he does so many other places in his writings as well. Anything else? Yeah. Right. Things that they were willfully ignorant about or blinding themselves to. Ken? Right. Right. If you're going to, claim your stake in being a Jew and want to be saved just by that fact and being a descendant of Abraham, there's a downside to that as well. Yeah, sure. Anything else? All right, look again, if you would, at chapter 2, verses 17 through 20. He says, "Indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know His will, and approve of things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law." So this sounds like some good complementary things that Paul is saying about them, or pretty much the whole way through. And to a certain extent, it is. But it was really the first thing that he said about them that kind of tears down anything else really being all that complimentary, where he said, "Indeed, you were called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God." You cannot rest on the law. Why not? Contextually, why can't you rest on the law? What have we seen up to this point? Yeah, you have to do it. You have to do it perfectly. If you want to be justified according to law, well, it's impossible because we have to keep it perfectly. But he's describing them in all these ways, and they do have an advantage, as we saw in chapter 3, 1 and 2. They have God's laws that he gave to Moses. They know who the true God is. Their conscience, their moral compass, it's going to be more in line with truth than the Gentiles, because they do have God's expressed laws that were given in past times. And then from verses 19 and 20, not only did they know these things, but what? They taught them to others. So here's the attitude of the Jew. Verses 17 and 18, "I am enlightened," in verses 19 and 20, "and I also enlighten others." We know that there is danger in teaching. What do we see in James chapter 3? If you were here last Wednesday, James 3 and verse 1, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." Teaching can be dangerous because it can puff us up. 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 1, "Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies." Teachers study, and what do they get? Knowledge. And then what do? They come out here and they dispense their vast knowledge on everybody else. And so it has the potential to make someone very arrogant. The teacher has the potential to assume that they know too much. In light of that, look at verses 21 through 24. "You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. I think Isaiah 52 and verse 5 is the quotation there. But he's saying, you know all these things and you enough to teach others, but did you forget something? Did you forget to do something very important? Did you forget to teach yourself first? Yes, practice what you preach, practice what you teach, embody what you say. You know, they kind of remind me of a group of older men who get up together early in the morning and get breakfast together. What are they doing? They're solving all the world's problems. If only the world would listen to all these solutions that we have to offer, the world would be perfect. There would be no more problems. That's kind of how the Jews were acting, but they forgot something very important. They forgot to apply it to themselves. And Jesus used this same reasoning with the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, all of these quote-unquote religious elite of his day. Nicodemus, a Pharisee, comes to Jesus by night so that he won't be seen. And he's got some genuine inquiries about this new teacher who is making such a great name for himself. Jesus drops some heavy truths on Nicodemus, of which Nicodemus was totally ignorant of. Here's what Jesus said to him in John 3 and verse 10. Are you the teacher of Israel and do not know these things? You're supposed to be one of the enlightened ones. You're supposed to be one of the wise. You're supposed to know these things, but you don't. Once again, he says to the Sadducees in Matthew 22:29, you are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. So, in other words, from the text, the Jews had a school of thought when it came to the Word of God, and that school of thought was wrong. You know, there's all these examples of things that people used to believe that we now know are not true. And we look back at the things that people used to believe and we say, man, that was really dumb. I can't believe y'all, used to believe all that. Like what? Well, people used to think that cigarettes were good for you, that they were healthy. Ironically, that they cured cancer and that they were medicine for your lungs. The majority of the world used to believe that the world was flat. And somehow, some people still believe that. But the majority used to believe that the world was flat. People believed in abiogenesis, or the thought that life can derive from non-life. People used to believe that radiation was no big deal at all. And so, we look at those things, we laugh at them, we think, how did people ever believe that? But those were just the accepted schools of thought of their time. And for the most part, nobody really challenged them until, people like Galileo came prove otherwise. Or when people, smoked a lot of cigarettes and they died from lung cancer, and some bright minds thought, I wonder if those things are connected or not. Or when people, died from radiation poisoning. But those were the schools of thought that went unchallenged for many years. And we have this tendency to think that mankind of yesteryear was so dumb, but we've got it figured out. And that's a dangerous thought when it comes to religion. It's a dangerous thought when it comes to spiritual things. These Jews had the condemnation that the Scriptures clearly told of, but they concocted a school of thought about the Scriptures that spun it otherwise. To think that being a Jew in of itself is good enough. So what's the lesson in this? We need to rely on the text more than the teacher. Got to rely on the text more than the teacher. I am not the authority. You're going to have to read and study for yourself and to come in contact with the authority. But the Jews had missed the point. And that's what Paul is trying to get them to see, particularly in verses 21 through 24. Once again, you who teach to not steal, do you steal? You who teach to not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who teach against idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, are you sure that you're keeping it? Theft, adultery, and idolatry. Why these three in particular? Any thoughts on that? Sir? Yeah. There's this tendency whenever you're studying a certain field, once you know about 3% of the field, you assume that you know the rest of it. But in actuality, we should come to that conclusion that you're talking about. Once we know something, that just opens up all these other things that we know we don't know. So yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yep. Yep. Exactly. All right. So these three things. He talks about theft, adultery, and idolatry. Any thoughts on why he might choose those in particular? Well, theft at least seems to me to be something that most of everyone has done at some point. As a kid, did you ever take something that you wanted, even if you knew it not to be yours? I think most all of us have. It seems like kind of a natural thing. I want, therefore I take. And so this would be an example that most of everyone could relate to. He also mentions adultery. Matthew 5:27-30, Jesus said, "You've heard it said that to those of old, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it out from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast in hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast in hell." So Jesus told them and us that it's not just the actual acts of things like adultery that are wrong, but it's the thought that is equally wrong. A thought that the Jews needed to be made aware of. And then this last one might seem to be a little out of place, idolatry. Maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but I don't think he's talking about Jews robbing pagan temples, but rather making money your idol and robbing the temple of God. Because this is what God said through Malachi 3 and verse 8. He said, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. Yet you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings." So I think he's using a people who know the scriptures and know that places like Malachi 3:8 exist, and saying to them, you abhor idols, yet you made money your idol by not giving to God what you were supposed to. So these three things, theft, adultery, idolatry, or maybe more specifically making money your idol. And he uses these three things to teach what James taught in James 1:22 and 25. James said there, "But be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word, not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in the mirror, for he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does." So it doesn't matter as much what you know as much of what you do. Oh, but I can quote the law verbatim. Cool. But did you obey the law? Us. I can quote the Sermon on the Mount verbatim. Okay, that's great. I know each of the books of the Bible in order. Great. But did you obey the word? Transformation is better than just information. Yep. Right. Yeah. And I think of him using Ten Commandments in particular as examples over and over. What is that? Chapter 15 as well. He's going to use them again. And I think the reason for that would be that a Jew could not plead ignorance, like you're saying, to not knowing what. Right. Right. Maybe if he couldn't use some obscure little of the 613 laws because they could say, "Oh, I've never heard that one before." But these are the Ten Commandments. These are what you have rested on and what you have learned as a child. Yep. Ma'am. you're talking about ancient Israel whenever they would go and take such and such a place. Yeah. Yeah, that could have very well been kind of just the culture. Yep, some were told, but yeah, and I think probably a lot of the ones that you're thinking of probably were not, though. Just kind of things that they did. They weren't told to do that. They just did it. Yeah, that's interesting thought to think that one of the Ten Commandments was you shall not steal. Yet there was kind of this culture of taking what you wanted. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Just like James talked about there, it's like a mirror. It's like a mirror. You see how you're living up, see how you are, and you fix what you need to. Anything else through chapter 2 and verse 24? All right, look once again at verse 25 through 29. It says, "For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and your circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision that is of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God." Now, this is specifically directed at the Jewish people, but what he's kind of saying here is really it's a problem that burdens all of humanity. It's a universal thing. I have a conscience, and I know that I've sinned against God. And when I dwell on that fact, it freaks me out. To think that I, in my thoughts or my actions, stand in opposition with God. So what we can do is we can kill our consciences by finding one thing that we've done that was really good. What do we see here? Oh, me? I've been circumcised. And so I'm part of the whole thing, and I'm okay. What about us? Well, me, I go to church. I may not be the strongest Christian, but I go to church every Sunday. Me, I read my Bible. Remember that one time that I helped convert that one person, that one time? I've been baptized, yes. I think I'm okay. Sometimes we find like one thing to hook ourselves to that justifies us in our minds, but that's not how justification works. Either I'm good on my own, aka impossible, or I'm no good and Jesus saves me. Those are the two options. And there's no middle ground. There's no gray area. Yes. Either I'm good on my own, which of course is impossible, or I'm no good and Jesus saves me. Those are the two options. So there's no gray area. Yes, Your Honor, so what if I did kill this person? You know what? I pay my taxes every year. So I think because I pay my taxes, I'm going to be justified in the eyes of the law regardless of anything else that I've done. It doesn't work that way. Circumcision was an outward sign, going back to what Jake said earlier, is an outward sign that you are in a covenant relationship with God. And I know that baptism doesn't have any kind of lingering physical effects, but circumcision was for the Jews kind of like what baptism is for us. So circumcision was placed on this great and lofty pedestal. Yes, sir. Yep.
To the person that did it,
Right.
and the person had been done to.
Right.
In reality, they're It should be no, hey, I'm going to stand up in the synagogue and let them be circumcised. That's something that's done individually.
Right.
But they see it as that outward.
Right.
As he's quoting out, because you're a Jew, you're certain.
Yep.
And so I'm part of the whole. I'm part of everything because I'm circumcised.
Right.
Well, then he tells probably one of the greatest arguments ever made in the New Testament, in my opinion. He shows how the uncircumcised can be better than you. He says right here, and would not the person who's uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law? Will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? See, a person who's not even a Jew can be as good as you are and not even be circumcised. That's what he's saying. Right? That's how holy you are, Mr. Jew. You know?
Yep.
You there's somebody here who's actually sincerely doing something that would be considered more justified.
Right.
And can even point the finger at you at people. I think that's one of the greatest arguments. Can you imagine if you're a Jew reading it?
Yeah.
That must either make you want to gnash your teeth and rent your clothes and do all that drama that they do, or it makes you think, wow, whoa.
Yep. And that is going to come, actually, in chapter 4. He's going to talk about Abraham. Abraham's their guy. That's their father. You know what the argument he makes there? Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. So this man who was not circumcised, he was blessed in what he did because he believed God, and it was kind of for righteousness. So if they're going crazy here, then he's going to bring Abraham into the mix, and that's not going to be good either. Ken? Right. Right. Yep. Right. Right. It's almost the idea of I'm a Jew. I'm part of this big thing, and now God's going to pick me up and carry me the rest of the way just on that basis. Yeah. It is very, very much so.
That's what we got to pray. The Pharisee is saying, right in the same room with that woman, saying, I thought so thankful I'm not like this guy. In the same room, he's saying that.
Right. Right. No shame in that, no shame whatsoever. Right. And so to kind of, laud yourself over that and place yourself over someone else for that is, even more ridiculous. Something happened to me when I was a kid that didn't happen to you when you were a kid. Yeah. Yeah.
And he even uses that in his arguments against them before his wrath comes down, saying, I was faithful, you were not. So in the same way that, and I think that's a valid point, because view a covenant on that level, sacredness, say, holy matrimony, it elevates it to a higher level. Just a shake hands agreement with, well, if I mess up, you'll understand.
Yeah.
You don't say that about your wife or your husband. You don't say, well, I just messed up, but she'll understand.
Right.
No, that's not what you do. You feel badly about it. You want to fix that. You want to make the covenant And the Jews didn't seem to do that. They kept putting the obligation back on God. If they don't do this, part of his favor. And that lack of humbling that they needed. I mean, we could point to at least 5, 6 times in the Old Testament where just humbling themselves would have been a good start.
Yep. Absolutely. All right, yeah. And once again, he's talking about circumcision, and he's, again, this was such an important thing for the Jewish mind. But Paul tells us, like he does here, and in Galatians chapter 5, that circumcision does not stand alone. Kind of going back to what Ken was saying. Galatians 5, 1 through 3, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing, and I testify to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. So it was an outward sign of the covenant, but the covenant was the whole thing. James 2 and verse 10, for whoever shall keep the whole law and yet someone one point, he's guilty of all. If you break one law, you might as well have broken them all. And so circumcision wasn't going to save them. The same way that one good thing that we did that one time isn't going to save us as well. Now, taking a look at chapter 1, verses 18 through chapter 2 and verse 29 as a whole, here's something to notice, and I kind of mentioned this earlier. When Paul was talking to the Gentiles about their sins, it was almost as if he was saying, hey, y'all have sinned, and you know it. Your conscience tells you that you've sinned. Nature tells you that you've sinned. It's just obvious. Now he's having to put a whole lot more work in to convince the Jews that they are also sinners. He's having to use these arguments against them, whereas the Gentiles, for them, he just stated it plainly. Because all of this is an offense to the Jews. And it's an offense to any religious people. Again, but I'm not like them. I'm not like those pagans. I'm not like those atheists. I'm a good person. But as Paul is pointing out here, the scriptures say otherwise. The scriptures are saying, no, you're not a good person. You just know what good is. You just know what right from wrong is. But again, knowledge won't save us. It matters much more what we do than what we know. And it's a good practice to check up on yourself every now and then and ask yourself, am I saved? Am I saved? Because people can do all sorts of awful things. People can live all sorts of cruel lifestyles. They can be liars, abusers, this or that. But then at the end of the day, what do they think? But I've got Philippians memorized. But I go to church. Again, I go to church. But I've been baptized. We need to recognize that we are so desperately in need of Jesus. And we may claim to, but sometimes our actions may say otherwise. So it may take a lot of convincing in order to convince someone else that they are indeed a sinner, but we have to do so out of love. I know that you're religious. I know that you know from right from wrong, but have you taken the time to teach yourself first? Any questions or comments through Romans chapter 2? Yes. Yep, absolutely. Well, that's all I really have. I don't want to get in chapter 3 because that'll just be too much for the next 3 minutes that we have left. So we'll go ahead and close out there. Thank you for your time and for your attention, and we will pick up next week.